Marina, what led you to the writing of this book?
So I became interested in the question of vulnerability because there's a certain narrative we get with the ancient Greeks. Commonly, we'll talk about Aristotle or other ancient views of virtue that emphasize the great-souled man who has courage, who has generosity, who has all these positive virtues. And then there are these little glimmers in writings like the Ethics of places where something else is going on. For example, Aristotle talks about the vulnerability involved in losing a friendship in which the friend has somehow become a bad person after having been good or sufficiently good. And he really wrestles with the question of how to deal with that aspect of human life. So I became really interested in this other side of the narrative of what the human person is that is surprisingly untouched by a lot of scholars who tend to emphasize the virtues over vulnerability.
What would you say is the readership for this book?
The book is basically oriented to a pretty general audience. My first book, Plato and the Rhetoric of Philosophers and Sophists, was much more technically oriented. It gave some very detailed contrasts between philosophy and sophistry in the Platonic dialogues. I deliberately wrote this book in a more essayistic form, partly because I thought it's a kind of perennial human interest issue. We've all been vulnerable. We've all had to live with loss. There are a number of themes in the book, like mortality, political exile, judgment, all kinds of themes that I think would be meaningful to people who aren't necessarily professional philosophers.
Talk about the process you went through to select these authors and works that you use in the book.
Yes, definitely. So the main texts I look at are a few Greek tragedies, Homer's Iliad, 2 Platonic dialogues, Aristotle's Ethics, and then Aristotle's tragedy, work on tragedy, the Poetics. I could have definitely chosen other dialogues. One reason I chose the ones I did was in Plato, in terms of Platonic dialogues, there's a real emphasis on Plato being anti-tragic. So Martha Nussbaum is someone who focuses on the anti-tragic Plato, and I tried to choose 2 dialogues that I thought did the best job of refuting that more traditional approach to Plato as anti-tragic. When it came to the ancient texts that were more literary, they actually came a lot out of my teaching at Boston College. So the Philoctetes is a text that I was teaching in the Pulse program. It's about a man who is wounded and then is abandoned on an island by his fellow comrades. It touches on a lot of the issues that we teach about in Pulse, marginalization in society. How do we treat, say, homeless people who might, like Philoctetes, not really fully belong to the human community? And it was through the process of teaching that text a few times that I came to really develop my own thinking on it. So there certainly are other texts I could have used, but I stuck to a few texts by Sophocles that I knew from my own teaching and really spent a lot of time with.
You make an interesting connection between one's recognition of personal vulnerability and the life and politics of his or her community. Can you say something about how this relationship works in the text that you're writing about?
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the texts I look at is the contrast, actually, between Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus. In Oedipus Rex, we see an Oedipus who is both the king and the person who's polluting the city. And he exhibits a real harshness towards whoever this mysterious and as yet unidentified polluted man is, that I really think we need to look at a little critically. Luckily for us, Sophocles actually does that in a much later play. When he writes Oedipus at Colonus, he presents Theseus as someone who's able to welcome Oedipus into the city of Athens. And so there's this implicit idea there that Theseus himself was an exile, that he himself was an exile before he came to rule into Athens, and so he's able to accommodate Oedipus into the city in a very sympathetic and compassionate way. One of the things I like about that play is that Sophocles doesn't give us particular reasons why Oedipus should or shouldn't be allowed to become part of the city. He actually dies near the edge of the city and is somehow transformed into this sort of mysterious other. What I appreciate about that is it's not really setting up criteria for what constitutes an acceptable or unacceptable status in the city, but rather Oedipus is presented as a sort of mysterious someone. And I think there's a way in which Sophocles enters into something like the mystery of other persons in a way that emphasizes the concreteness and particularity of the person. So I wasn't so much in that chapter aiming for, are there general rules and principles by which, we need to accommodate the other into the city, but rather the sense that Sophocles has captured something about the mystery of otherness and the idea there's this potential in the other that can somehow contribute to the city in ways that we can't already anticipate.
Your book is part of a project making it freely available on the web. At the same time, the publisher is marketing it in the usual way. Tell us what you know about this project and how you got involved.
Yeah, so Oxford invited me to participate in an open source project. From what I understand, they've paired a number of different books across different disciplines, in which one book in the project is simply marketed in the traditional way, and then a second text of a similar theme or similar anticipated audience is marketed both traditionally, normal publication, normal kinds of marketing, and then also available as an open access PDF on the web. And so I think they're looking to see whether this might enhance sales because the book becomes better known, or whether it might affect sales negatively, to see what kind of effect it has on the traditional marketing of books to add the open access piece. I'm really excited about this project because I favor open access sourcing as much as possible. I think it's helpful to have intellectual works available more widely to small libraries as well as to large libraries, to individuals who can't necessarily afford to buy texts that are more expensive, as most academic books are. So I'm really pleased that this book will be more widely available, and I hope that it leads presses to make other books more widely available in the future.
What would you like to be the takeaway for the reader of your book?
Yeah, I guess I'd like a reader to consider his or her own vulnerability, as well as to engage compassionately and sympathetically in the vulnerability of others. I don't explicitly link the text to contemporary political issues, but I think there are links that can be made. So I'm hoping that people will spend some time thinking about what those are in their own contexts, their own societies. For me, for example, I have thought a lot about the issue of immigration and our own country's current debates on immigration. It's not something that comes up explicitly in the text, but implicit in the idea of looking at the question of immigration is the sense that, like Theseus, our country is a country of immigrants. Theseus is able to reach out compassionately to Oedipus as someone who belongs in some ways within the city and can be its protector because of his own experience. And I hope that readers will bring in their own thoughts about contemporary political as well as personal issues.
I've heard some authors say that they write the last sentence of the book first and then write the rest of the text leading up to it. Is that the process you followed in writing your book?
No, I don't think I wrote, I knew where I was headed with the book while I was writing it. In fact, something kind of interesting happened with respect to the work on Aristotle, which is the very last chapter of the book. The last chapter seeks to kind of try to tie together all the other chapters by looking at what tragedy does for the political community. So the idea is that we should look at Aristotle's idea of catharsis in terms of how does witnessing a tragedy as a community in a performative sense help us to understand ourselves better. And I think it was only the process of going through the Iliad, these tragedies, and these dialogues that led me to understand that kind of wider political significance. So I think the unfolding of the book kind of in some ways mirrored my own understanding, which unfolded as I went through the writing process. I feel like the writing process itself helped me to discover and learn things that I would not otherwise have learned.
Given what you've just said, can you just read that last sentence for us?
So the last sentence says, our own political communities would do well to respond in a similar fashion, that is, understanding human limit and vulnerability, not marginalizing the vulnerable, but instead recognizing a common bond between the vulnerable and oneself. So my thinking about that idea is that we, I think we actually tend to do all we can to distance ourselves from what's vulnerable in oneself. So I think a common human strategy, for example, is we think that if we find enough ways to do the right things, we won't be vulnerable anymore. And many of these stories, the Iliad, for example, where we're literally in a life and death battle scene, and we're faced with the question of mortality as Achilles is, reading that book ought to lead us to recognize certain fundamental truths about ourselves, like that we're mortal, that we can be wounded by people in our political community, as Philoctetes was. In the Symposium, we see how love makes us vulnerable. So these kinds of things, by reading them or witnessing tragedies about them, ought to help us to attend more to our own vulnerability. And when we see our own limits and we see our own vulnerability, we're much more capable of seeing it in others and seeing how that vulnerability in others isn't something to be feared, but is something to be embraced, and that actually helps us to live in closer community with one another.